Sarah, a 20-year-old college student, was used to her busy life. Between attending classes, working on assignments, and hanging out with her friends, her weeks always seemed to fly by. She lived far from home, relying on the weekly allowance sent by her parents to manage her expenses. Life was predictable, comfortable, and to some extent, easy. But one day, everything changed. As Sarah was planning her usual weekend grocery trip, she received a text from her dad. It read, "Sarah, we've had some unexpected expenses this month. I've only sent you half of your usual allowance. Try to manage, please. We'll sort things out next month." Sarah froze. She had never thought about managing her expenses on such a tight budget. Her pantry was almost empty, and her favorite snacks, fancy coffee, and convenience meals were already on her shopping list. "How am I supposed to survive on this?" she thought, staring at the amount in her bank account. At first, Sarah panicked. The idea of cutting back on her regular habits seemed impossible. But as the initial shock wore off, she decided to take it as a challenge. "Maybe I'll learn something new," she told herself. Little did she know, this small budget would not only teach her about saving money, but also change her perspective on life in ways she could never imagine. The next morning, Sarah sat at her desk with her notebook open, trying to figure out how to make this work. She scribbled down a list of essentials: rice, bread, milk, eggs, and some vegetables. But as she added up the prices, the total was already over her budget. "This isn't going to work," she muttered, her frustration growing. Determined not to give up, Sarah decided to head to her usual grocery store and see if she could find cheaper options. As she walked down the aisles, everything seemed expensive. The organic vegetables, her favorite snacks, and even the coffee she loved were now out of reach. She felt overwhelmed. After filling her cart with just a few basic items, she hesitantly walked toward the checkout. The cashier scanned the items, and the total flashed on the screen. It was more than Sarah had expected. Embarrassed, she asked to remove a few things and paid for the rest. Walking back home with her small bag of groceries, she felt defeated. "How do people live like this?" she thought. She was used to buying whatever she wanted without thinking twice. Now, every decision felt like a struggle. That evening, as she stared at her nearly empty pantry, she realized her usual habits wouldn't work anymore. She needed a new approach. A sudden idea struck her. What if I check out the local markets instead? Maybe they have better prices. The next morning, Sarah set out to explore. She found a small farmer's market a few blocks away, a place she had never visited before. The smell of fresh produce and the colorful stalls instantly lifted her spirits. She wandered through the market, comparing prices and talking to the vendors. It was here she met Mrs. Emily, an elderly woman with a warm smile. Sarah hesitated but eventually asked her, "How do you manage to shop smart on a budget?" Mrs. Emily chuckled softly and replied, "It's all about knowing what you need and avoiding what you don't. Stick to seasonal items. They're fresher and cheaper." Inspired by Mrs. Emily's advice, Sarah left the market with bags full of fresh vegetables, fruits, and even a small pack of spices, all within her budget. She couldn't believe it. For the first time, she felt a small sense of victory. Back in her small apartment, Sarah spread out her market purchases on the kitchen counter. It felt different this time, not just groceries, but a challenge she had conquered. With her limited ingredients, she decided to experiment. She searched online for budget-friendly recipes and discovered a simple vegetable stir-fry. The first attempt was far from perfect. The vegetables were slightly overcooked, and the seasoning wasn't quite right. But as Sarah took a bite, she smiled. It wasn't just a meal, it was her effort that made it taste special. Over the next few days, Sarah found herself growing more creative in the kitchen. She learned how to make hearty soups, quick salads, and even homemade bread with just flour and water. Every meal felt like a small achievement, and the joy of cooking from scratch began to replace her cravings for expensive takeout. As she continued shopping at the farmer's market, her bond with Mrs. Emily grew stronger. The elderly woman always had a new tip or recipe to share. "Try soaking lentils overnight. They're cheap and full of nutrients," she once said. Sarah eagerly followed her advice and soon discovered the magic of making filling lentil curries. Her roommates, who had initially teased her about her budget experiment, began noticing the changes too. They would peek into the kitchen, curious about the delicious smells wafting through the apartment. One evening, Sarah invited them to join her for dinner. She had prepared a simple yet tasty meal of rice, lentil curry, and sautéed vegetables. As they ate, her roommate Jack exclaimed, "I can't believe you made all this on such a small budget. You should teach us how to shop and cook like this." Sarah laughed but felt a surge of pride. But the lessons didn't stop at cooking. Sarah began tracking her expenses in a small notebook, marking every penny she spent. She realized how much she had wasted on unnecessary luxuries in the past. Now, every purchase felt intentional and meaningful. However, one evening, something unexpected happened. Sarah went to the market to thank Mrs. Emily for her advice, but couldn't find her at her usual spot. When she asked another vendor, he replied, "Oh, Mrs. Emily isn't feeling well. She's been staying home these days." Sarah felt a pang of worry. This woman, who had unknowingly taught her so much, was now facing her own struggles. The news about Mrs. Emily stayed with Sarah, and she couldn't stop thinking about her. The following morning, she decided to visit Mrs. Emily at her home. She had never done something like this before, but it felt like the right thing to do. She asked around the market for her address and, with some effort, found a small house tucked away in a quiet street. When Sarah knocked on the door, Mrs. Emily answered slowly, her face lighting up in surprise. "Sarah, what a lovely surprise. Come in, dear," she said, her voice as warm as ever, despite looking tired. Inside, the house was modest but cozy. Mrs. Emily offered Sarah a cup of tea, but Sarah quickly insisted, "No, you rest. Let me make us some tea instead." As Sarah prepared the tea, she noticed how sparse the kitchen was. It struck her that Mrs. Emily, despite her wisdom and resourcefulness, was likely living on an even tighter budget than Sarah had been. They sat together, sipping tea, and talked for hours. Mrs. Emily shared stories about her younger days, how she raised her children alone after losing her husband, and how she had learned to manage with very little. "It's not just about saving money, Sarah," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's about appreciating what you have and making the most of it. Life doesn't always give us what we want, but it gives us enough to survive if we're smart." Sarah felt a lump in her throat. She realized how much she had taken for granted: her allowance, her comfortable lifestyle, even the small luxuries she used to indulge in. "I've learned so much from you, Mrs. Emily," she said, her voice full of gratitude. Before leaving, Sarah asked if she could bring Mrs. Emily something from the market. But the old woman smiled and replied, "Just your visit today has been more than enough, dear. You're always welcome here." Walking home that evening, Sarah felt a wave of emotions. She had started this journey thinking it was just about managing a budget. But now, it had become something much deeper. She had gained not only practical skills but also a profound appreciation for resilience, gratitude, and human connection. Back at her apartment, Sarah decided to write down everything she had learned, from cooking simple meals to managing money and, most importantly, finding joy in small things. In the weeks that followed, Sarah's life took on a new rhythm. She continued to shop at the market, experiment with meals, and stay within her budget. But now it wasn't just about saving money, it was about living with purpose. She found herself cherishing the little things: the smell of fresh vegetables, the joy of trying a new recipe, and even the quiet satisfaction of balancing her expenses. Her roommates, inspired by her transformation, joined her on her budget-friendly journey. Together, they started cooking meals as a group, sharing recipes, and even competing to see who could create the tastiest dish with the least amount of money. One day, Sarah decided to visit Mrs. Emily again, this time carrying a basket of fresh produce she had picked out from the market. When she arrived, Mrs. Emily welcomed her with the same warm smile. As they chatted, Sarah said, "I've been thinking, Mrs. Emily. Everything you taught me has changed my life. I want to share it with others. Maybe I could start a blog or a small online group to help people learn how to shop wisely and cook on a budget." Mrs. Emily's eyes sparkled. "That's a wonderful idea, Sarah. Knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied. And who knows, you might inspire someone else just like you were inspired." With Mrs. Emily's encouragement, Sarah got to work. She began writing down her journey, from her struggles with budgeting to her newfound love for simple living. She posted tips, shared recipes, and even uploaded videos of her cooking experiments. To her surprise, the response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life reached out to thank her for the practical advice. Some were students struggling with limited pocket money, while others were families trying to make ends meet. Sarah's story had struck a chord because it wasn't just about budgeting, it was about resilience, community, and finding joy in the little things. One evening, as she sat in her kitchen, surrounded by her roommates and the aroma of a hearty stew, Sarah reflected on how far she had come. What had started as a simple challenge had turned into a life-changing experience. She smiled and said to herself, "It's amazing how much you can learn when you stop chasing perfection and start appreciating what you have." And in that moment, Sarah realized she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving, one simple budget-friendly meal at a time. Moral of the story: sometimes, life's greatest lessons come from the most unexpected challenges. Learning to adapt, appreciate, and share can transform even the toughest situations into opportunities for growth.